the horror story of Flint and the repercussions of the Flint story continue to come out in the media. We continue to learn more. Arthur Delaney has been covering that story for the Huffington Post. He is a senior reporter there. He is also co-host of the Huffington Post Politics podcast, that's hard to say, which is called So That Happened or So That Happened. Arthur, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, listen, you were on the Hill. We're recording this on Thursday. You were on the Hill this morning for testimony from the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder. Let's start there, as well as the head of the EPA official. But let's start with Rick Snyder. How did that go?
Well, this was basically the Super Bowl of the Flint water crisis because everyone had been looking forward to his testimony. It seemed like he didn't want to come or Republicans didn't want to invite him, but he came, and he's been following a strategy of constantly apologizing and admitting that his state screwed up real bad, and it was not surprising that that's what he continued to do today. And the thing that happens at hearings like this happened, which is everyone called him out for blowing it. So that was the dynamic. He was ready for that, and not being defiant or denying that the state government had made terrible mistakes that led to the poisoning by lead of thousands of children in Flint, Michigan.
Well, was this the kind of apology that you get where it's, gee, I'm sorry I didn't watch my subordinates more closely, as opposed to, I'm sorry there was a widespread pernicious pattern of suppressing the truth to the residents of Flint? I mean, which kind, if you don't mind my asking, which kind was it?
It was the former. I mean, he doesn't admit to having suppressed the truth. What he said is that, I really regret that we didn't ask questions that could have uncovered this way before we ultimately found out that there was lead in the water, which was in October. But all along, after they had switched the water source in Flint, people knew there was something wrong with this stuff because it was brown.
Right.
And while people were literally marching in the streets in Flint, the scientists in the state were like, well, there's nothing really hazardous about it. It's just a little brown, so you can still drink it. And we have a lot of emails from the state government that show people who did raise concerns about it were told by, supposed experts, don't worry. And so nothing has really been unearthed to show like a really willful, malicious desire to suppress information, more just the culture of looking for the easiest possible explanation. But what I think is really shocking about it is that the water was brown.
Right.
So for 18 months, you were like cool with people drinking disgusting water as long as it didn't violate federal law in terms of like actual lethality.
Well, what was the? Yeah. I mean, I guess in reading your reporting, Arthur Delaney, and other people on this, I guess what I'm struggling to get is the nature of what went wrong precisely. I mean, to me, I feel there was negligence. When you're drinking brown water for 18 months, as you say, something is seriously wrong. I would think somebody would go out immediately and order tests and retests and triple tests and try to get to the bottom of it. We know that bad decision-making led to the problem, but when we get to the problem itself, after it occurred, what was it exactly? Were these guys just persuading themselves that there was nothing to worry about, or were they deliberately neglecting a population? Would this been, as many people have said, a different story if it had been a largely white city? Or do you have a feel for any of that?
I think people are right to focus their outrage on the fact that this was going on, and they weren't more curious about what could be wrong with brown water that smelled weird and tasted bad and caused rashes. But we have a system where, in the United States, national policy, the Flint water crisis has exposed how we regulate this kind of problem. There are lead pipes almost everywhere, and we're okay with that. And we're okay with a certain amount of lead being in the water, as long as it doesn't cross a threshold that is not based on human health at all, just a totally arbitrary number of parts per billion that you can have in the aggregate water supply in a given city. So they were looking at that and say, well, we're not above the action level, so we don't have to worry about it. And the regulation allows municipalities to game where they test samples, so it doesn't even look as bad as it is.
So basically, it was a culture of just passing the buck to the federal rules and not worrying about it too much. Is part of it, talking about it at the national level for a second, is part of the problem that we just don't want to, we as a nation don't want to admit that there's a massive problem with these lead pipes, because that would mean a whole lot of infrastructure spending to pull them out and replace them?
I think that is actually the problem. And what's amazing about Flint is that this is, to my knowledge, the first time the government has ever admitted people were poisoned on a grand scale by lead in the water supply, even though this has happened so many times. And one of the whistleblowers in Flint was busy with a similar case in Washington, D.C. 15 years ago that, by his reckoning, was 20 to 30 times worse, and the government to this day hasn't admitted that it even happened. The D.C. water utility doesn't even admit that lead water poisoning is possible. So this is a reckoning with lead in water, that the likes of which we've never had. And what's important about the hearings today is the highest of levels of government are looking at what solutions there could be, how regulation went wrong at the federal level.
So we've heard the stories about the children who will lose or have lost cognitive functioning as a result of lead poisoning and will, suffer from that their entire lives, and the other health problems that have arisen. So you're saying this is a national problem. This is probably occurring in other cities across the country.
Yeah, it's through population level rigorous testing of kids' blood that they found out what was happening in Flint. If you consume lead and it knocks a few IQ points off, you'll never be able to prove it as an individual. Even if your blood lead levels are high, this just says that this is one thing that can happen, but no red light goes on that indicates one person had lead poisoning. So this is happening potentially all the time, all over the place, and since the symptoms can be so subtle and so varied, there's no way to know. But we caught them in Flint.
Right.
And that's remarkable.
Right. So, and speaking of whistleblowers, we're talking with Arthur Delaney from the Huffington Post and from So That Happened, the political podcast. So, speaking of whistleblowers, you wrote about one of them, Miguel del Toral, regulations manager for the EPA. Tell us his story for a second, if you would.
So, the water was controversial in Flint for a long time before the lead poisoning problem came to light, and he investigated what was up with how they were treating their water early last year. And he found out they weren't doing the corrosion control that prevents water from leaching lead out of lead pipes. And so he drafted a report saying, look, they're not doing corrosion control, there's going to be lead in the water, in June of last year, and the EPA told people in Flint not to worry about it. And so now Republicans on their Hill are saying this guy is a whistleblower. He was retaliated against, and at the hearings this week, the EPA vehemently denied that. But it seems like it's kind of true. There's an interesting partisan dynamic where Republicans are hammering the EPA, Democrats hammering Rick Snyder, and the partisanship has probably been useful in exposing every facet of what has gone wrong.
That's really interesting because, so in other words, the Democrats have exposed Rick Snyder and the state government's role. And of course, you have the whole issue of the emergency managers in Flint and, the decision making that led to this situation. And the Republicans out of partisanship have helped expose the EPA's role in this. I wonder, though, Arthur Delaney, that the partisanship may have helped us learn more about the origins of the problem. But it seems to me it could prevent us from doing anything about it.
Well, yeah, it's definitely two sides to it. Like, on the one hand, some of this Snyder bashing is partisan grandstanding. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't think we would have even heard about this if it weren't for Democrats and people in Flint wanting to go after the Snyder administration, and that really motivating people to to get the water tested, to cooperate with researchers, to dig up documents that showed later exactly what mistakes had been made. But as for solutions, I think you might have a point. It's not clear how partisanship could contribute to revising federal regulations that are like kind of arcane.
Yeah, well, not only the regulations, but then now I would argue we have some construction work to do on our hands too. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not an engineer or an expert in this stuff, but we're going to have to spend some money to solve this problem, and I think that could be a challenge. Let's talk about Rick Snyder for another second. I know at one point in this process he was giving out emails, but not necessarily all of them. Do we know for a fact we have all the relevant emails now?
No, and we'll be able to wonder whether he's cherry picking emails because it's his office releasing them. But he did release an initial batch, and people are like, well, these don't even go back to the years that actually covered the decision relating to Flint's water. And after that, he's released more and more emails. So he has released a lot of emails. A lot of emails from his office were captured through FOIA requests to other state agencies. Michigan, by the way, seems to have one of the much better open records laws that has let reporters and especially independent researchers get their hands on this information. But Democrats said today they're frustrated. Their top aides to Snyder aren't being made available. So even though he's been pretty forthcoming, there are definitely some things he's not throwing out there.
Right. So he's kind of titrating out what he releases. He also, according to your reporting on this, said there are many communities with potentially dangerous lead problems, and that it was he blamed dumb and dangerous federal regulations of lead pipes. Is that a legitimate concern, or is it blaming the federal government? Is it passing the buck uphill, or does he have a point there?
It's a little of both. He is adamant that he doesn't want to point fingers, and he did point fingers maybe a little less than everyone else. But you could also see how it's convenient to have a Democratic bad guy for him. But it's true. It's true. There are 10 million homes and buildings in the U.S. that get water from pipes at least partially made out of lead, and those pipes could put lead in your drinking water anytime. There's just no guarantee that it won't happen anywhere you have a lead pipe. So he's right, and his explanation for what has gone wrong has changed. In January, at his State of the State address, he said, "Well, the Flint City Council voted in support of this," and that was really kind of unfair. And he doesn't say it anymore. Mm-hmm. Instead, he talks about the dumb and dangerous federal regulations. And the whistleblowers in Flint, Mark Edwards, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who were fighting his government, say exactly that same thing. And he's basically sided with them, aligned himself with people who were working against the government, who definitely think the federal regulations are dumb and dangerous. So what's happened is Rick Snyder is trying to turn himself into a water safety evangelist.
Right.
I think it's maybe the right thing to do, maybe also the only political path for him, since he doesn't want to resign, clearly.
Right. You know what bothers me about this, I guess, is though I never want to miss a chance to bash Republicans usually, it bothers me that the Republicans aren't looking at their side of the street and the Democrats don't seem to be looking at their side of the street in terms of EPA's handling of it. I wish people could. I hate to sound like Obama, frankly, but I wish people could get above partisan politics and put the health of kids and communities first. But it almost sounds like that hasn't happened, or certainly hasn't happened yet.
I think Elijah Cummings, the top Democrat on the committee from Maryland, actually has shown through his questioning over the 3 hearings that they've had, he really understands what the state did wrong and also the EPA's role, and he's been totally critical of both. And Republicans on the committee also have been heavily critical of Snyder, even as they may prefer to attack the EPA. So at least within this one microcosm, this one committee, I think it's been a pretty thorough response from both sides. and then the partisan grandstanding is a little bit more coming from the backbenchers.
All right. Well, fair enough. And Arthur Delaney, before I let you go, we got about 30 seconds. Why don't you just tell us a little bit? I know you write for the Huffington Post. So what's the So That Happened or So That Happened podcast?
It's a weekly, roughly hour-long podcast, and we have guests. We have members of Congress, and it's published every Friday morning. So please subscribe in iTunes and give us a listen.
I definitely will. You do that with Zach Carter?
Zach Carter and Jason Lincolns are the other co-hosts, and we have a rotating cast of HuffPost reporters who join us each week.
All right, so power trio and a rotating cast. Okay, well, Arthur Delaney of the Huffington Post, and So That Happened. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.